Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, J.P. Bristow. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 52, The Qipchaks. Before we begin, thank you to new boyar Andrew, to Tsar Mohammed for his continuing support, and everyone else subscribing through Spotify or Apple Podcasts. The Qipchaks have already entered our story as the steppe enemies and sometimes allies of the Rus. We have been calling them the Polovtsi, as the Rus did. But this and all the other names that they were known by are simply local renditions of Qipchak. The only exception to this might be Cumans, although there is some debate over whether this is a variant of Qipchak or the Qipchaks and Cumans were two tribes within a confederation. This is a bit of a shorter episode, as a proper introduction was too much of a digression to fit into another episode. Although there are no Qipchaks with us today, they had a wide-ranging influence across the steppe, in the Caucasus, the Balkans, and Hungary. Many of you will be aware that in China, the Mongols eventually assimilated with the Chinese, in Persia with the Persians. But the Golden Horde was assimilated and Turkicized by the Qipchaks, and through that process, they were involved in the formation of many of the Turkic groups who lived in the Russian Empire, who continue to speak languages derived from Qipchak Turkic to this day. This means they have a much bigger role in our story than merely being the rivals of the Rus. So this episode is to give them a proper introduction. Although the deepest origins of the Qipchaks are as difficult to find as those of other Turkic groups, the earliest traces we have are from the 8th century, when they were associated with the Uyghurs. They are generally believed to be mentioned in the Orkhon inscriptions, although the word that is taken to be referring to them has been damaged, and they were part of the Gokta Khaganate. When it collapsed, they moved towards the Irtishim, Ishim, and Tobol rivers and received their first mentions in Islamic works. Persian geographer Ibn Khordadbeh's Book of Roads and Kingdoms placed them as living between the Pechenegs, who were still in the Volga-Urals region, and the uninhabited north, as part of the Kimyk Federation, along with the Karluks, Kimyks, Oghuz, Magyars, Turkish, and Kyrgyz. According to Ibn Khordadbeh, they were autonomous within the Kimyk Confederation, and according to the Hudud al-Alam, by the 10th century they had become the leaders of the Confederation. A neighbouring confederation, which may have had a more Mongolic component, called the Kun, took over the Kimyk Confederation as it declined and merged with the Qipchaks. The Kun may have been the source of the name Kuman, but in any case, all of these names mean something like pale ones. In Latin, they were the Pallidi, and in other European languages, they were given similar names. Early sources imply that the name derived from their appearance, with consistent references in Chinese and Western texts to them having light-coloured hair and eyes. Some historians argue that it was actually their horses that were light-coloured. Modern genetic and archaeological data suggest that the Qipchaks had mixed origins. At some sites associated with them, excavations have uncovered remains that appear to be East Asian. Genetic testing of remains identified as Qipchak have found that some have strongly East Asian ancestry, some European, and some Iranic. We can assume that they included peoples of various origins who had been Turkicized. We do not know whether pale ones matched their own meaning of Qipchak. There are quite a few theories as to its original meaning, including hollow tree, which derives from their tribal origin myth of their ultimate ancestor having given birth to her son in a tree. Other theories include its meaning quick-tempered, the unfortunate, or the contrary, the fortunate. The surrounding sedentary societies tended to call whatever region was closest to them the land of the Qipchaks. For Muslim writers, Dasht-i-Qipchak, the Qipchak Plains, meant the Central Asian steppe. For the Russians, the Polovtsian steppe meant the Pontic steppe, which was called Kumania by the Byzantines. Western Europeans placed Kumania further west, including Wallachia. Some Qipchak groups migrated into Islamic territory in Central Asia, while others moved towards the Pontic steppe, and others remained in Siberia. They continued to be pushed into Central Asia by events in the east, culminating in a major migration at the beginning of the 12th century, when the Jurchens caused the Liao Empire in northern China to collapse, and from there they moved further west into the Caspian steppe. They assimilated other Turkic peoples included in their confederation. In the west, these included the Oghuz Turks, Bashkorts, and Bulgars, while in the east they included the Kimek, Karluk, and Karakitai, as well as Mongolic groups. The result was a nomadic confederation covering a vast area from the Danube to Siberia and the Central Asian oases, which included Mongolic and Iranic groups, as well as Turkic and Turkicized groups. However, it never became an empire united under a single Khan, or developed any real political unity. The various tribes remained under the control of independent leaders. In the 12th century, Jewish traveller Petachia of Regensburg wrote of the Qipchaks that they have no king, only princes and royal families. Within the Confederation, there were several regional groupings. There was the Central Asian, Ural-Volga, Don River, Dnieper River, and Danube groups. Some sources refer to black and white Cumans, using the traditional Turkic nomenclature for north and south. Some scholars claim to have identified 12 distinct groups. The Rus chronicles tend to give clan or tribal names without being clear which is which, or where they got the information, but we do have a clear division between the Polovtsi they do business with and the wild Polovtsi who live further away, sometimes raid, and are consistently hostile. Despite these various groupings, the Qipchaks did not form a state in the pre-Mongol period. That is, they did not have a central authority that monopolized power, collected taxes, acted in foreign affairs, determined how force would be used, or performed the other functions of government. Qipchak organization was based on kinship and loose associations. Their lifestyle did not push them towards developing other forms of social structure. In this they were far from unique among steppe societies, as you can probably tell from our previous discussions. Statelessness was the norm among nomadic societies, which all lay on a continuum from completely disorganized to using quite sophisticated organization, but still without developing those state institutions. When a steppe society moved towards statehood, it was usually in response to interaction with a settled people. This was a much more common phenomenon at the Chinese end of the steppe than it was in the West, as China was both more vulnerable to nomadic incursions and sometimes takeovers, and more actively tried to project its own authority into the steppe than the Western powers did. At the same time, the pastoral nomadic system was inherently more unstable and precarious than agricultural society. It could make ordinary nomads much wealthier than peasants, as well as providing vastly more personal freedom, which was why nomadism was so successful for so long. But as wealth grew into overproduction, think of herds larger than the territory can support, conflicts arose that resulted in forced migrations, while sudden outbreaks of disease or shifts in weather patterns could devastate herds. Agricultural societies could be more self-sufficient, while nomadic societies were always looking to interact, whether by trade or conflict. When a sedentary neighbor was weak, they raided. When it was strong, they negotiated. Conquering a sedentary state frequently did not work out well for the nomads. Their ruling dynasty might end up seduced into forming a new royal dynasty of their sedentary vassals, which then became alienated from its nomadic power base. From the earliest Chinese records, we have steppe rulers warning their heirs against conquering and moving into cities where they might lose their identity, which, when it did happen, often led to the collapse of the new dynasty as it lost its former followers. The average nomad warrior also had little to gain from a conquest. Evidence from the Mongol Empire suggests that the rank and file became poorer as the empire became more entrenched and their role changed within it. When one steppe empire that had been moving towards greater centralization collapsed, as we've seen with the Xiongnu, Huns, and Turks, the survivors usually shifted back towards statelessness under their new rulers, even when they came from the same clan, which contributes to the impression that the steppe was always in a state of flux, even though most steppe empires lasted as long as their sedentary counterparts. So we should not be seeing the Qipchaks not forming a state as an anomaly or some kind of interim stage between other steppe empires that came before or after. Their statelessness was appropriate to the time that they were living in, and the absence of pressure towards centralization that they experienced in their interactions with their neighbors. The Rus were not the only neighbors that they interacted with. The Qipchaks began raiding Khwarezm, which lay in what is now Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, at around the same time as the Seljuks were beginning their rise to power in the region. They became allies to the Khwarezmians and then the Seljuks. Kagri Beg, one of the Seljuk generals, claimed that he had converted a Qipchak leader to Islam and then joined their families through marriage. The alliance between the rulers of Khwarezm and the Qipchaks was reinforced through further marriages to the daughters of the Qipchak Khans, say Islamic historians. However, as we have sometimes seen elsewhere, these marriage alliances were not especially effective. The Khwarezm Shahs had other priorities and often only wanted to use the Qipchaks as a stick to go along with the carrot of their trade offerings. While the Qipchaks joined in with intrigues among the various factions in the government, often causing more trouble than benefit. Through their connection with Khwarezm, many Qipchaks became the original Mamluks, slave soldiers of the Islamic world, who would develop into a powerful military class that ended up ruling some Muslim states. Thanks to this, we have Qipchak Arabic dictionaries from Egypt that provide us with knowledge of their language. From somewhat later, we also have the Codex Cumanicus, a text compiled by missionary priests with the Italian slave trading missions in Crimea. It includes Latin Qipchak, Persian Qipchak, and German Qipchak dictionaries. These texts help trace the development of modern languages, such as Crimean Tatar, from Qipchak. The city of Sudak in Crimea was of particular importance to the Qipchaks as a trade emporium. Muslim writer Ibn al-Ar described it as the city of the Qipchak, from which their material possessions flow. It is on the Khazar Sea. Ships bear clothes to it. The Qipchaks buy from merchants and sell them slaves and furs. As you might expect, many of the Qipchak living in close proximity to these Muslim regions converted to Islam. It took another generation for the Qipchaks to reach the western steppe, where they drove the Pechenegs and Oguz onto the Balkan territories of the Byzantine Empire, where they would eventually be destroyed, and began raiding the Rus. They never attempted to conquer Rus, just as the Rus did not attempt to conquer the steppe at this time. Instead, as we have already heard, they swung between raiding, serving various Rus knyazes as mercenaries, and, as in Central Asia, entering into alliances secured by marriage. Vladimir Monomach, for instance, concluded 19 peace treaties with the Qipchaks, as well as being the most successful Rus ruler when it came to warfare against them. His rivals, the Olgovichi of Chernihiv, used Qipchak allies or mercenaries against the other Rus knyazes 15 times. Under Vladimir Monomach, the Rus established supremacy over the Qipchaks, as they had previously done with the Pechenegs and the Turks. It is clear that when Rus was united, it was able to dominate the forest steppe belt enough to push any nomadic raiders back far enough into the steppe to avoid serious danger. However, as we have already seen, Rus unity was fleeting, and instead the knyazes continued to use the Qipchaks in their rivalries with each other, with the Suzdalian knyazes being particularly successful at doing so. When Vladimir Monomach drove the Qipchaks out of the Rus borderlands, some of them moved south and became involved in the Caucasus. King David Agmashenabeli of Georgia married the daughter of a Qipchak leader named Atrak, who was the son of Shahrukh, a leader of the Wild Cuman Federation. The kings of Georgia had developed a tradition of marrying into the steppe peoples bordering the Caucasus, and David used troops Atrak supplied to unify Georgia. Some Qipchak groups settled in the depopulated areas of Georgia, and with their continuing support, David made Georgia into a regional power that lasted until the Mongol conquest. The kings of Georgia used the Qipchaks as a counterbalance to their unruly aristocracy, which eventually resulted in the Qipchak leaders becoming heads of aristocratic factions of their own. Among these Qipchak, conversion to Christianity became common, with mass baptisms accompanying some of the marriages between Qipchaks and Georgians. The alliance with the Qipchaks enabled the Georgians to resist Seljuk attempts to conquer them. Further west, Qipchaks who had been raiding the Byzantine borders took service with the empire. Other Qipchaks joined the Bulgarians and played a significant role in the Second Bulgarian Empire and its rivalry with Byzantium. The Qipchaks fought in every army, for every side, and for every ruler and pretender in the Balkans. The three dynasties that ruled Bulgaria between this time and the Ottoman conquest, the Assanids, Tertorids, and Sismanids, all had Qipchak origins. Following the Mongol invasion, the Qipchaks reached as far west as the Hungarian plains, where they took service with the kings of Hungary. They formed Nadikuzhag and Kiskunzhag, Great Cumania and Little Cumania. In 1227, the Cumans of Kunzhag underwent a mass conversion to Christianity. Pope Gregory IX established a diocese of Cumania within the Archbishopric of Esztergom, and Biela IV of Hungary added Rex Cumaniae to his titles. The Cumans fleeing the Mongols were welcomed, and traces of Cuman language and customs remained in the region until modern times. So you might be asking why, if they were so involved in the life of their sedentary neighbours, the Qipchaks did not form a state or attempt to conquer one or more of these neighbours. The answer is simply that for a couple of hundred years, the Qipchaks were living in ideal conditions to support their nomadic lifestyle. They had extensive pastures, which benefited from favourable environmental conditions throughout this period. There was no new wave of migration putting them under pressure from the east. As a loose confederation, their political weakness meant that they did not organize for a large-scale assault or an attempt to conquer the settled civilizations bordering the steppe. And conversely, this meant that they were not a sufficient threat to those civilizations to force them into organizing to extend their power into the steppe either. Rather, they established a kind of equilibrium. Their lack of political unity also meant that they were able to fit into the system of relations that they encountered in their neighbors, whether Rus, Georgia, Khwarezm, or Hungary. They could serve as mercenaries or allies, even establishing marriage ties and becoming strongly integrated into these systems, without abandoning their position in the steppe. This gave them easy and reliable access to the food and manufactured goods that steppe peoples wanted from sedentary societies, and the wealth needed for Qipchak leaders to maintain their positions. So, unlike their predecessors, the Qipchaks were neither destroyed through escalating conflict with the settled world, nor supplanted by new waves of migration from the east. And there is some evidence to suggest that they did eventually begin moving towards the formation of a state, and were in the process of uniting under a single leader in the western steppe. But the Mongol conquest put an end to this process. However, that was not the end of the Qipchaks. They integrated into the Mongol system as easily as they had integrated into others. We find Qipchaks in prominent positions throughout the Mongol Empire, from the Caspian to Yuan China, and eventually they Qipchakify the Ulus of Jochi, the Western Mongol Khanate that became known as the Ulugh Ulus, or Great State, its Qipchak name. Join me next episode as we turn our attention to another people who have been cropping up in our story, but who have not yet been properly introduced. the bolts. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.